Shalom, family. Good to see you all here. Hope you're doing well. Well, Donald Trump is back at it again. And this time, he wants to use the military in Minnesota. And it's not just that, this gives him a lot more power. And we already know Donald Trump wants to skip elections and he wants to just stay in power without elections like a dictator. And I guess this is his gateway there, using this Insurrection Act. And I mean, I know things are bad in Minnesota, but I don't think you need a military up there. I think that's taking it a bit too far. The problem is you gave ICE agents immunity and they're up there being abusive towards the public. And you're going to always run into problems when you try to give this immunity out. That's where you're going to always run into a lot of problems. But hey, it is what it is. So, y'all, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen so we can get started. And also a special shout out to Wanda Burke, who gave me a very generous Zelle. I thank you deeply, and I pray the Most High give it all back to you tenfold. Special blessings to you. All right, y'all. Let's see here. All right, please give me a 1 if you can see my screen. All right, thank you.
Well, we've used the National Guard to be very successful in Memphis. You can see the numbers are falling like rocks. Washington, D.C., Chicago is getting better, even though we're going through a lot. And, we're trying to do it in a very nice way. I've allowed, as you know, as president, like 50% of the presidents have used the Insurrection Act. They could use that. And everybody agrees you're allowed to use that. And there's no more court cases. There's no more anything. We're trying to do it in a nicer manner. But we can always use the Insurrection Act if we want. I mean, you take a look in the past, one in particular president used it 28 times during the course of a presidency. So we're allowed to do that. We thought we could do it in a very nice way. All we want to do is have safe cities. We're not looking for anything that would be spectacular other than crime-free become spectacular. We want to have great crime-free cities. So I'd be allowed to use, if I wanted, the Insurrection Act, and then all of this nonsense would go away. You have the absolute right. It's the strongest power a president has, and you have the absolute right to do it. We wanted to go this route, but we get sued every time you look at somebody. You look at somebody the wrong way, and you end up getting sued. We just want no crime. We want to have crime-free cities.
I describe it as violent, and a violation of the law in many places. I discussed with the president this morning several things that we are dealing with under the department and different operations. We did discuss the Insurrection Act. He certainly has the constitutional authority to utilize that. My hope is that this leadership team in Minnesota will start to work with us to get criminals off the streets.
Let's get to those violent clashes that have been happening in Minnesota. It's hard to watch the video. It's really just aggressively hard to watch the video following yet another shooting involving an ICE agent. Now, this morning, President Trump did not take the temperature down. He threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act. And if you don't know it, you're not alone. It's an 1807 act that really allows the president to put federal troops in for civil unrest or an armed rebellion. He says if the corrupt politicians of Minnesota, those are his words, his words. Don't obey the law. This is despite the fact that the mayor of Minneapolis has gone on, other Minneapolis politicians have gone on, and so the violence is not helping those who need the help most, and they're really trying to take the temperature down. The undocumented immigrants of the city are the people that they are concerned about.
And what does that mean? If the president does, in fact, invoke the Insurrection Act, it would give him the power to deploy the military and federalize National Guard troops. And it would be, federal National Guard troops. And it would be the first time that it was invoked in more than 3 decades.
Yeah, I think the last time it was used, and just off the top of my head, was in the 90s during the riots in Los Angeles.
The guy in the White House is threatening to invoke the Insurrection Act to send soldiers to occupy Minneapolis. Here's what the Insurrection Act actually does. So what is the Insurrection Act? It's an old law that allows the president to deploy active duty military troops inside the United States. So its purpose is to suppress rebellions and uprising, and its vague wording makes it easy to misuse. Normally, the Post-Comatosis Act prevents the U.S. military from acting as a domestic police force, but the Insurrection Act overrides that rule. So if invoked, the president can send soldiers into American cities to perform law enforcement duties, from putting down an insurrection to enforcing court orders. Now, this gives one person the power to decide what constitutes a crisis, and it can be used indefinitely. The Insurrection Act has been used roughly 30 times in U.S. history. Initially, it suppressed armed rebellions. Later, it was used to break labor strikes, dismantle the Klan, and to enforce desegregation during the civil rights movement. So last time in recent memory that it was used during the 1992 LA uprisings, when people rebelled after the cops that brutalized Rodney King were able to walk free. And no president has ever sent troops against a state's wishes since 1965. Now, this law is a powerful tool that is used to try and crush righteous rebellions, moments when oppressed people rise up and say enough is enough. And the threat to use it is now meant to frighten people in Minneapolis fighting for justice into silence. But Minneapolis will not be scared into submission. This is the birthplace of the George Floyd Rebellion, and the people will continue to take the streets to demand justice for Renee Good, because this fight is just too important to stop. And if the guy in the White House truly wants the protest to end, he doesn't need to send soldiers to occupy Minneapolis. This could all end tomorrow if the officer that killed Renee Good is indicted and convicted for her murder, and ICE is taken out of our communities for good.
We need to talk about the Insurrection Act because President Trump is talking about the Insurrection Act. He wrote today, if the corrupt politicians of Minnesota don't obey the law and stop the professional agitators and insurrectionists from attacking the patriots of ICE who are only trying to do their job, I will institute the Insurrection Act, all in caps, which many presidents have done before me, and quickly put an end to the travesty that is taking place in the once great state. Now, obviously, Trump is responding to the unrest we are seeing on the ground in Minneapolis, Minnesota, after he ordered what he calls the largest federal immigration crackdown in U.S. history. Now, there is a lot in that post that is Trump's opinion and perspective, which you may or may not agree with. But the reality is, when it comes to invoking the Insurrection Act, Trump's perspective and opinion on the situation is really the only thing that matters. So if Trump does invoke the Insurrection Act, which he has not done yet, what does that actually look like, and what does that mean? Well, the Insurrection Act is technically not one law. It's a bunch of laws that have been around for more than 100 years. This set of laws authorizes the President of the United States to deploy the U.S. military within the borders of the United States to, 1, suppress an insurrection in a state if asked to do so by a governor. 2, to suppress a rebellion or enforce laws when ordinary judicial proceedings are insufficient. Or 3, to suppress insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy that obstructs state or federal law execution, which deprives citizens of their constitutional rights and authorities cannot protect them. So the question is, what's the definition of rebellion and insurrection? Well, the law defines it as inciting, setting foot, assisting, or engaging in any rebellion or insurrection against the authority of the United States, the laws thereof, or gives aid or comfort to those who do. Now, if you've ever looked up a word in the dictionary and the definition includes the word you're looking up, you know that's not a definition. It's a problem, because you're still left wondering, what does that word actually mean? And that's what we have with the Insurrection Act. The issue with this set of laws is that they are extremely vague. They are overbroad, and they can be easily interpreted in any way, which leaves them vulnerable to abuse because of the lack of definition. Congress has not updated these laws that clarify those definitions in more than 100 years, and the courts have really not gotten involved in it either. That's why I said the only opinion that matters when it comes to invoking the Insurrection Act is Trump's. Because what we know for sure about the law is it clearly states the president has the power to invoke the Insurrection Act if he believes what he sees on the ground qualifies as an insurrection or rebellion. So if Trump does invoke the Insurrection Act, what does that look like? Well, normally U.S. military cannot be on the streets of America conducting civilian law enforcement operations because of the Posse Comitatus Act, which explicitly bans that from happening because of the real threat to civil liberty. But the Insurrection Act is a valid exception to the Posse Comitatus Act. So if Trump does invoke the Insurrection Act, you will probably see the U.S. military on the streets of Minneapolis working alongside ICE agents and Homeland Security officers. The Insurrection Act does not limit the number of military members the president can send to an area like Minnesota. But most importantly, you need to understand the Insurrection Act does not invalidate your constitutional rights. Your First, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth Amendment rights to free speech, to your right to silence, your right to have a lawyer, your right to not be subject to unreasonable search and seizures, those are all still intact. They will still need a warrant, even if it's the U.S. military asking while being deployed through the Insurrection Act. Now, I could talk about this forever. President Trump has absolutely threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act in the past, and other presidents have absolutely used the Insurrection Act before. But there is one key difference between this threat from Trump and all the other times it's actually been used in the past. And I'm going to talk all about that in a special post in my Substack tonight. So make sure you follow these easy steps and you sign yourself up so you don't miss it.
President Trump's threat to invoke the Insurrection Act is sparking concern among critics who warn that the law's sweeping powers make it easy to misuse, especially in moments of domestic unrest. To help us understand what's at stake, we're joined now by Elizabeth Goitein, Senior Director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Based on President Trump's past rhetoric and past actions, how seriously should we take the prospect that he might actually invoke the Insurrection Act?
I think we need to take it seriously. He has certainly threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act in the past. But this is coming on the heels of a Supreme Court decision that rejected his efforts to use a different law to deploy the military in but that left open the possibility of using the Insurrection Act. And so I think in the wake of this sort of defeat that he faced in his attempts to deploy the military elsewhere, he might be looking for an opportunity to show that he can still make good on his threats to use the military as a domestic police force inside the United States.
And practically speaking, how would he do it?
Well, under the Insurrection Act, he would issue a proclamation, and then he would have the authority, at least unless the courts held that he didn't, to deploy either active duty troops or to federalize the National Guard and deploy National Guard forces, and under the Insurrection Act, he can, at least in theory, use them to conduct law enforcement activities. So the Insurrection Act is generally considered to be an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act, and that's the law that normally prohibits federal armed forces from engaging in civilian law enforcement.
How often has the Insurrection Act been used, and in what situations?
It's been used very sparingly. And I should say that even though the law on its face is written in vague and archaic language that seems to give the president quite a bit of discretion, the Department of Justice has long interpreted it more narrowly and has opined that it should only be used as a last resort. And in keeping with that approach, presidents have invoked the Insurrection Act only about 30 times in our nation's history. And in virtually every one of those instances, either a governor requested assistance because state and local law enforcement were completely overwhelmed, or the state itself was actively obstructing federal civil rights laws.
If a president were to deploy federal troops to a state like Minnesota over the objections of the governor and local officials, what would that mean legally? Where does state authority end and federal power begin?
Well, the president has the authority to federalize National Guard forces and remove them from state command and control when authorized by statute. And so, if he invoked the Insurrection Act, he would take command and control of the National Guard. Now, the states could file challenges in court and could argue, and I think they would have a strong case, that the president was exceeding his authority under the Insurrection Act, and that the actions of the military were in fact violating the Posse Comitatus Act. In that case, a court could enjoin the president's use of troops, but in the initial, invocation of the act, the president does have the authority to assert command and control over federalized National Guard forces.
So why, in your view, would this be an illegitimate use of the act?
Well, there is chaos in Minneapolis, but it is chaos that is of the federal government's own making. The vast majority of the violence and lawlessness in Minneapolis is coming from ICE. And the purpose of invoking the Insurrection Act would not be to quell that violence and lawlessness, it would be to enable it. That is clearly an illegitimate use of the Insurrection Act. And more than that, it would set an incredibly dangerous precedent.
And that plays into what critics argue, that the deployment of these ICE agents to Minneapolis and the protests it sparked, that this was all just a test case to justify invoking the Insurrection Act and potentially deploying the military to Democratic-led cities in this election year. That was the plan all along, that immigration enforcement was really just a pretext, to which you would say what?
Well, the president has certainly been very clear that he does not view the use of the military in U.S. cities as a last resort. He actually has said that he thinks that U.S. cities should be training grounds for the U.S. Armed Forces. And, if you look at the last 9 presidencies combined, not including the first Trump administration, presidents have deployed troops to quell civil unrest or enforce the law only twice. President Trump has deployed troops or requested or attempted deployment of troops 7 times in his first year in office. So he certainly intends to use the military very differently from the way the presidents have used it in the past and the way that the law has been interpreted to permit the use of the military in the past.
Elizabeth Goiteen with the Brennan Center for Justice. Thanks again for your time this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so this is what Donald Trump is trying to do. I don't really think it's necessary. I really don't. But I think Donald Trump knows it has a lot of power, including, you can skip elections if he has this insurrectionist power. And at the end of the day, there's an underlying agenda. Now, why is the Insurrection Act necessary for Minnesota, but it was not necessary for January 6th? Okay. But, it is what it is. For real. This is so stupid. Boaz Yesaral, thank you for the super sticker. PM2290, thank you for the 2 channel memberships. And no, I don't think that's it. Never mind. It's there twice. And thank you for the super chat. B1 and Shalom Lisa, our protector, Lisa, sister. Times have been wild as the Most High is clearing the way for his return and prophecy. Let's keep our prayers and our heads on a swivel. Get well soon, Lisa. Thank you so much. I deeply appreciate you and your support for my channel. The bottom line is Donald Trump in this whole thing, in my opinion, he's just looking for power. He's looking for power. He did take a black eye on the National Guard. The Supreme Court ruled against him, and he had to get the National Guard out of all these cities. And we know he only targets blue cities. He doesn't go after anything in the red states. So he's going to continue to do that. with this Insurrection Act. He will only enforce it in blue states or sanctuary cities. It won't be in any red state at all, you know. But at the end of the day, y'all, it is a mess in America. It is a mess in this country. You know, look at what happened. And this is just the beginning of the Gentiles' New Year. And look how the year is starting out. Look at this. And you still have the possibility of another government shutdown. You know, I mean, the government is only funded up until January 31st. And you think they would be talking about this now, you know, squabbling over how they're going to fund the government. They're not even talking about it at all. So we shall see. Well, you know, the 250-year anniversary is coming up July 4th for America. So, you know, they're planning on having a lot of people come to Washington, D.C. So it's supposed to be a very big event in America. So we shall see. That will be the 4th of July of this year, 250 years. Yeah, because it was 1776 and this is 2026, 250 years. Mm-hmm. Boy, but things are not looking good in America. It is not looking good at all. And just this week alone, all the news about the dollar and I think it's only been about a week since Renee Good was taken out. And I think you know what it is with really the white people. They cannot believe a white woman got taken out. They can't believe that ICE is actually in Minnesota, not only roughing up the public, but roughing up those white women. They are really catching hell, you know, and a lot of those cars where they snatch people out, a lot of them were white people. I saw a couple of white guys too that got snatched out of their cars by ICE. And I think they are outdone looking at that. They never thought that kind of stuff would happen to them. And it is. And I think that has a lot to do with why they are so turned up in Minnesota because of the things that are happening to them. They never seen this kind of stuff happen to them. But it is here. It is here. And now they're looking around like what is going on? Well, all the things that happened to us are now happening to you. And didn't we try to tell them that? You see, when you co-sign what the cops do to us, you don't realize all of that's going to come back on you. Well, we are in those times now. We are in those times. I guess you're going to have to deal with it. We had to deal with it all by ourselves. We didn't get no support from anyone. So it's time that y'all stand on your 2 feet and deal with it on your own. So y'all, this concludes my live stream. Thank you so much for all of your support. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your donations. And again, I pray the Most High will give it all back to you tenfold. Special blessing to each and every one of you. Shalom, family.